Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the comparative anatomy of hind limbs. In this lecture, we're first going to take a look at some marine mammals that have completely lost their hind limbs, and those are going to be the fully aquatic species, including the cetaceans and the sirenians. And then we'll take a close look at the hind limbs in pinnipeds, including a differential between the otariids and the phocids. And finally, we're going to introduce a concept called morphometrics, which is a quantitative way to do comparative anatomy. Before we get started, let's go ahead and review the basic components of the lower limb. In humans, this is known as the leg and the foot, or the hind limb in most other mammals. So in most mammals, we have basically a pelvic girdle, which includes the hip bone. And then jutting out from that, we have the femur, which is the largest bone in the human body. And then below that, we have the knee joint, which includes the patella. And then we have the tibia and fibula below that. That makes up the area of the lower leg, or the calf area. And then, of course, below that, we have the bones of the feet. So now that we've done a quick review, let's go ahead and take a look at how the lower limb has changed in some of our aquatic marine mammals. Let's start with cetaceans and sirenians. Now, these are distinct taxa, but interestingly enough, because they are both fully aquatic, they have actually completely lost their lower limbs, or their hind limbs, which is evident in this skeleton of a sirenian, or manatee. So one thing that people kind of get confused on then is, where are the tails? And it's important to understand that flukes, which are usually used for the propulsion of both cetaceans and sirenians, are not hind limbs at all, but rather outgrowths of blubber and skin and connective tissue from the last set of the vertebrae, which would essentially be like a tail in a cat or a dog. So that's where the flukes are. Now, although the lower limbs themselves have completely been lost in both of these diverse taxa, it is important to see that sometimes we see what's called a vestigial pelvis. In other words, a small set of bones that are still remnants of what used to be a really large hip bone. But since there's no lower limb to support, they've actually lost that hip bone, and it's been reduced to a very small bone if it's there at all. So even in a giant whale, I've actually seen some vestigial pelvises before, and they're about this big, which is incredibly small when you're looking at a 40-foot animal. So then maybe the question is, why do they even still have that? And the answer is they actually use it for a couple spots of muscle attachment. And in males, it's actually used to help attach the genitalia. So it does retain a function. It's just not supporting the lower limbs like it was initially intended to. So why the loss of the hind limb? And the answer is actually because of drag. You could imagine that if you were trying to swim essentially with your tail all the time, having these legs stick out would be cumbersome and make it harder for you to assume that streamlined shape that's so important when you're trying to maintain a swimming speed without expending a ton of energy. So of course, natural selection favored the loss of the hind limb in these fully aquatic species. And so here we see yet another example of convergent evolution, because the cetaceans and the sirenians evolved independently, yet they both have lost their hind limb. With that, let's go ahead and turn to the pinnipeds. Now, the pinnipeds have retained their hind limb, and this is an important idea here because the pinnipeds spend some of their time on land and some of their time in the water, and so they actually need their hind limbs at the very least for mobility on land, and in some cases it's used strictly for motion in the water as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're looking at with the structure-function relationship in pinnipeds. And we're going to start with some trends that we see among all the pinnipeds. So when we take a look at what's called the body outline, you know, when you think about a pinniped, you kind of think of this fusiform shape, and then there's these limbs that are kind of down at the bottom there. Where what's sticking out? What do we actually see as these lower limbs? And the answer is actually only the ankle and the bones of what we would consider to be the feet. It turns out that the femur and the tibia and the fibula are actually up inside of the body form. So also, we notice that the legs are positioned straight back. They don't sit out on the side like they do in a lot of like other aquatic animals like salamanders, and even we might think of like cats or dogs that are kind of going out on the side. Rather, it looks like we've taken those limbs and we've kind of put them straight back. So they go straight back where the tail would be, and they are really held there quite tightly. So that's rather an interesting idea. And you might see here in this picture that the phalanges, which are what we would consider to be the toe bones or the finger bones, are quite large. And of course, they're going to be used in some cases for propulsion. So now that we've looked at some similarities, let's take a look at some differences. And the differences come about when we first look at the function. Otariids and phocids use their hind limbs differently, both on land and in the water. So when we take a look at the water, phocids, which are going to be your true seals, use their hind limbs rather exclusively for propulsion. And if you might imagine for a moment that my hands are going to be the hind limbs, and of course this is going to be what you would see at the tail end of a phocid, they kind of do this motion. And that's the motion that they do to actually move themselves forward in the water. In contrast, otariids, which are your fur seals and your sea lions, do not use their hind limbs for propulsion. They use their front limbs. They're called front limb or forelimb swimmers. But they do use their hind limbs for motion on land, and they have the ability to actually rotate their hind limbs underneath their body as part of a walking mechanism on the land. So that brings up this really interesting question. From an anatomical standpoint, why can otariids rotate their hind limbs forward, but phocids cannot? And it turns out that the answer actually lies in the shape of the ankle bones, bones that are actually found between the tibia and the fibula of the lower leg, and then the phalanges or the toe bones of the feet. And one bone in particular, which is the astragalus, is one that actually is the difference. And it's just one little bone makes all the difference in being able to take those hind legs and rotate them underneath your body so that you can walk, versus ones that cannot. They stay behind the entire time. And so what I want to do is take a closer look at that set of bones and see if we can piece together how does form, fit, function. All right. This is a picture that basically shows a close-up of those ankle bones. And what I would like you guys to note at the outset is that on the left-hand side, you see that in the area that would be considered to be the ankle, one bone is considerably larger than the other. And the large bone is called the heel bone, and then the smaller one is the astragalus. In the other side, we see the phocids, and we see that the heel bone and the astragalus are about equal in size. So why does that matter? Well, it turns out that if we imagine that my fist for a moment, my fist is actually going to be the astragalus, and that this is going to be the heel bone. If I have this anatomical positioning, I can rotate like this, which allows me to take my flippers from the back and move them forward like this. But if my bones look more like this, which is what we see in the phocids, then we don't have one ability to rotate over the other. So because I think this is such an important concept, I'm actually going to come over here to the dot cam and draw it for you guys. If you have a pen or pencil, now would be a good time to get it out and draw this with me. We're just going to do kind of a simplified stick figure drawing of the ankle bones to see how this might change the rotational ability of the flipper. So we'll go ahead and start with the phocids. Here. Now, the astragalus in the phocid is going to be approximately equal in size to the heel bone, and they kind of sit together. And then, of course, underneath it, we have the rest of the bones of the feet And then we'll go ahead and just put out some phalanges, which are going to be the flippers. And then above it, we have our tibia and our fibula, which kind of arch out like that, etc. So that's what we see for the phocids. Now let's take a look at how this region right in here changes for the otariids. In this region, the astragalus is much smaller and the heel bone is much larger, and it kind of wraps around a little bit like this. That allows you to change the positioning of your flippers. Like so, while still maintaining your tibia and your fibula. All right, so once again, we can see that here, this is the smaller bone is the astragalus, is that by making it smaller and by making the heel bone bigger, it has the ability to rotate around, where we don't see that with the phocids. So just that one little bone makes all the difference in basically being able to use your hind limbs on land, or using them, or not being able to use them on land by rotating them underneath. All right, so now that we've taken a look at that, let's take a look at some of the other things as well that we see as a difference. Because the phocids use their hind limbs for propulsion, we also notice that their phalanges tend to be a lot longer, and then their tibia and their fibula are kind of held tightly together because they don't need to rotate around. They're just stuck back there, really. And of course, they're doing this motion during the propulsion. And so it's not useful for them to have a lot of motion in their upper limbs. Where in the otariids, because the otariids do not use their lower limbs so much for propulsion, in fact, hardly at all, but they do use it for land, we maintain a lot of the mobility, and we see a lot more movement in that entire limb. Things aren't anchored so tightly together to allow for that plasticity when they're up on land. So now that we've finished with the hind limb, let's go ahead and move forward and take a look at morphometrics. Morphometrics is going to be the quantitative analysis of form or structures. So this is a way that in comparative anatomy, we can basically try to determine from a quantitative standpoint how the skeletal system has changed as we move from the terrestrial system to the marine system. And of course, such information gives us a nice understanding of adaptive evolution or evolution because of natural selection. So I'm going to throw up this picture here, and when you take a look at this picture, I would like you to look just at the wolf skeleton versus the pinniped and the cetacean skeleton, which of course are two representatives of the marine mammals. And you might notice I see differences, especially in the limbs. And of course, you see in the pinnipeds, the limbs are, as we just saw, the hind limbs are straight back. In the wolf, they're underneath the body, which is more typical of terrestrial mammals. We also notice that the limbs seem to be of different shape and maybe of different proportion. Those are some things you might notice when you look at a picture, but how could you quantify it? So we're going to do a quick example here that shows us how we can quantify changes in limb proportion. What I have here is actually an upper limb of a human versus a fin whale. And in order to do the morphometrics, what we're going to look at is percentage. So you might notice that in the human you have, and watch closely, total length going from the shoulder all the way down to the fingers. Now, if we just take a look at the humerus seems to make up approximately 40% of the total bone length. But do we see that same proportion in a whale? Let's take a look. Again, we'll make a line and we'll say, okay, this is going to be the total length of the upper limb for the fin whale, but what about the humerus? The humerus is really short. In fact, the humerus seems to make up only 15% of the total limb length. And this is an example of how comparative anatomy can use quantitative measurements to help us actually ascertain some of the adaptive evolution. And with that, I will see you next time.